I'm Iris Muller. I'm a certified rehabilitation counselor and a proud mom of 2 children, one of whom has quadriplegic cerebral palsy and is nonverbal.
And I'm Alma Schneider, a licensed clinical social worker and the proud mom of 4 children, one of whom has Prader-Willi syndrome.
In this podcast, we discuss the uncensored truth about raising kids with disabilities.
Prepare to laugh, cry, and hopefully learn something new. This is Two Moms, No Fluff. Hello, everyone. Hello, Iris.
Hello, Alma.
Welcome, everyone, to Two Moms, No Fluff. This is a podcast where we talk about all things related to parenting children with disabilities. Welcome, 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 especially to those people who have never been here before. We hope you will get something out of our episode. All right, so Iris, you want to let everybody know what we're talking about today?
Yes, today we are going to talk about education, how we chose educational pathways for our children and what it entails and involves. And hopefully you can find yourself somewhere in this wide spectrum between Alma and myself and all that is in between.
Yeah, there's a lot. We happen to have taken different paths from the very start. And it's funny because as you're saying that, I'm thinking, I'll bet a lot of people, including myself, didn't even know that they had a choice. It never occurred to anyone that they even had a choice to do homeschooling or unschooling or going to your district school or an out-of-district school. So there are many options, and what we have chosen are both very different. So should I start, Iris?
Go for it, Alma.
Okay, so as I said, I didn't even know that I had a choice, but had I had a choice or known that I had a choice, I definitely would not have chosen homeschooling because my child is a real handful behaviorally, and I had 4 kids at the time, or 3 kids at the time 4 kids at the time when he went to school, and for me it was, oh my gosh, I'm gonna have other people taking care of him, and I'm gonna have a little break. And again, it didn't even occur to me that there would be an option for me to do that, because it was called the Developmental Learning Center. It was a special needs pre-K, and they provided all the therapies in the preschool for him, and we went directly out of early intervention into this pre-K. So I think also that's another reason why people might not be aware that they have options, because you're led by the hand. You're just following the professionals. We're all so early on in our journey by the time our kid goes to preschool that we're just following what anybody tells us. And I think we all kind of learn as we go along that, oh, there are other things that they didn't mention, because they certainly didn't mention a homeschooling option or a typical preschool option, which we'll get into in a little while. But my kid went directly into the disabled pre-K. It's called the special needs pre-K. And it was quite simple at that time. I didn't have to worry about him having any issues at school, because they kind of took care of him. They never called me. So it wasn't, I know that some people have a challenging time when they enter preschool. For us, and that might open their eyes to other types of options for their kids. But for me, it was a very easy time. They never called me. There were never any issues. He was still young enough so that behaviorally he wasn't getting into that much trouble. So I'll start there. Do you want to talk about your beginning journey?
Yes, I think first of all that they don't mention to the parents that there's other options, because they're almost like systematically there almost aren't any other options. And when I had my child, I already knew that I was going to homeschool and maybe even do like radical unschooling. I had my opinions, my philosophy about education and knowledge. And when my child turned out to be a child with a disability, not a typical child, it complicated everything, because especially all the early intervention programs are kind of geared to be delivered in a school setting. and they do all of that in group settings, whether it's like a nursery or pre-K and whatever. And to get all of those services outside of the system is something almost outrageous that people haven't heard of. And they also doubted not only like how and if she would get the services that she needs if she's not going to a kind of a dedicated system for it, but also they were kind of like, this is going to be like a parent cannot handle the situation that is so complex that it would we are kind of ruining her opportunities or her future by not sending her to a ready-made kind of program for kids with disabilities. So I think obviously it's not an easy pathway, and I do know of other families that do homeschooling with kids with disabilities. I don't know of other unschooling families with children with such complex disability. I am not sure if there are families out there. I really do want to connect with you guys, so just let us know in the comments. But it was kind of like really carving a pathway kind of step by step for a family and for my child, maybe based on the ideology or the ideas that I had in mind and not wanting to give them up just because she has a disability.
Yeah, and that brings up the point that we've discussed in other episodes about how we don't just show up as parents doing things for our kids. We have a whole life of experience and understanding about different philosophies, as you mentioned, when we are making these types of decisions, or simply not the ability to think out of the box, or to even think to think out of the box, because if we've always been kind of a rule follower, or if we showed up, I'm remembering, as I mentioned in another episode, when I was in middle school, you only saw really seriously impaired kids in school who were in the basement, and you had nothing to do with them. That might be another reason why you might feel terrified to send your kid to a typical school, because they were going to be segregated that way. So we all come to the table with a bunch of different ideas about what school or homeschooling is going to be like. For me, I had only heard about homeschooling from people who were very religious and made a point of not sending their children to school because they didn't want, evolution or other ideas to enter into their kids' curriculum. So that was my only understanding of homeschooling at the time when he was a baby. So just a reminder that we bring a lot of our own, I don't know if we should call it baggage, but our own experiences when we are thinking about our kids' education.
Yeah, and I think for us, for me especially, it felt the idea of school as a place where you acquire knowledge was always kind of like foreign, because you can't force someone to gain knowledge. It always needs to come from an internal point of interest that knowledge is acquired, and you can't draw a square on the floor and say, here is where knowledge acquisition happens. It happens throughout life in the most bizarre ways, in the most kind of random interactions. And I wanted to offer that for my child, but then, my child wasn't able to ask questions or show curiosity or handle objects in space and kind of put puzzles together, etc. And then it became really complicated, and I was kind of challenging myself with the question, how do we teach a child that cannot touch, manipulate, walk, try, ask, read, turn pages, look at things in the typical way that I formerly thought education can happen with. And we had to reinvent a wheel for her in a wheelchair. And it was an interesting journey. And I think that in a way, there are many advantages to a pre-existing system, because it's kind of, it alleviates some of the pressure of the parents of knowing what to do next, it's already written, it's already planned. And sometimes in the early stages with a young child with a new disability, it makes things much easier that you don't have to kind of struggle so much on the ABCs of education, literally.
Yeah.
It's just for us, because it was so important to me. This is like, this was a way to express my philosophy about the world through my kids, that I insisted that I'm not going to give up regardless of the disability. Again, like in retrospect, is this the smartest pathway? Is this the best idea or solution? I don't know, but I do know that we do need, as a society, as a, maybe an educational system, to offer those solutions to families.
Mm-hmm.
And many of the children and families that I know that are now homeschooling children with disabilities, unfortunately, ended up in that route, not from a philosophical point of view, just because they had some kind of interaction with the educational system that rubbed them the wrong way. And here I want to kind of mention again the individualized educational plan that the schools are mandated to follow. And I'll let you kind of take the stage a little bit and talk about that and how that can sometimes go right and wrong.
Yes, absolutely. But I have a question for you first. What allowed you? I mean, I'm so honestly, you just blow me away all the time. But in terms of taking that on, I mean, to me, it seems so incredibly overwhelming, and to take that on, to figure it all out with everything else you had going on physically with her, and I imagine, emotionally, all of the time that you have to spend helping her with different tasks. what how did you even begin the process of, because you had to write the script, you had to write, you, as you mentioned, you have to rewrite what's the expression, the forget it, with the wheel, you had to you had to create a whole new wheel, not reinvent the wheel, create a whole wheel. So how did you go about doing that? What was your first step, for example?
um, you know what? I'll sorry about that. It's COVID. No, I'm joking. You're not
No
allowed to
COVID.
cough anymore. But anyway, I think that it wasn't like as such like a big deal in terms of like okay, from tomorrow onward we'll be teaching at home. It
Right.
was just almost like an internal kind of center that I had, and this is the approach that I wanted to take. I
Mm-hmm.
think that there is something behind that, maybe about like a worldview that a person has
Mm-hmm.
about success and happiness and
Mm-hmm.
priorities. And is happiness success or success happiness? It's all of
Mm-hmm.
those questions that you need to ask yourself as a parent, what it is that you hope for your child. and
Mm-hmm.
then and then you kind of build things around that. And I think that for Karen, for my daughter, when we learned that she has such a complex disability, the things that were very, very important to me is that she's happy. and
Yes.
and every day that I can close the day and say that she was happy. And the other thing that I wanted to install in her is that she has control over her life circumstances. And even though she had such limited control over her body, that
Mm-hmm.
she does have control over her environment and life circumstance and what happens to her every day. And that kind of dictated everything else.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that maybe for some parents, the idea or the thought or the worry about school is that when you have like a 3-year-old that requires so much time and attention, like again in our situation with the feeding, it's also your situation here, with the feeding, and it's every little bite is a serious choking hazard, and you have to do so many tiny manipulation with so much love and attention that the parent is absolutely fearful of just transitioning them to the hands of a stranger that
Yeah.
don't love and care for them that much. And that kind of like puts them off from a traditional education
Mm-hmm.
system. And putting all of those steps that need to be taken to create the environment and make it work even financially, that both parents now can't work, one of them stays home to
Mm-hmm.
take care of the child or children. um, I just want to say that the important thing is that maybe to know that there are options, and sometimes, as you said, the system almost hides them from
Yes.
parents of children with special needs and disabilities.
Yeah. And also you're talking about, the child being happy, but if the parent is so stressed, and I know that just getting a child who who is using a wheelchair, what it takes for you to get out of the house, I've seen it myself. It's a whole production. So I would imagine that there's a lot less stress in that department. So it's not all, more challenges doing it from home. There's a lot of relief that comes from not having to rush out of the house every day and take all those steps to make, to get everybody ready to get out. And that, like how I feel on a snow day. Like even
Yeah.
though I don't necessarily love that everybody's home, um, it's I don't have to rush, and nobody has to, necessarily get dressed the way that they would if they were leaving. So I would,
Yes, yes and no. Like in a way, yes, it's not, I'm sure a family of four, like 8 o'clock comes, everybody needs to catch their ride, have their lunch ready, etc. That might be like extremely hectic and totally alleviated by homeschooling or unschooling. However, homeschooling is not, I want to reiterate, not what everybody experienced now during the pandemic, that the kids were locked at home. We
Mhm.
had tons of activities outside of the house. It was rare that we didn't leave the house on a certain day to do something outside and with other children. It's only when the pandemic hit that also our kind of center of activity um, closed suddenly. But regardless, it's kind of like it's not in the same fashion. Like the kids do wake up whenever they want to wake up. If
Yeah,
you decide on a certain day that you don't want to go to like judo for homeschooling families, nothing would happen. You
yeah,
do
yeah.
want it. It's not a tragedy. You don't have to bring a doctor's note. So there
Right.
is a lot more freedom in it, and you can also decide, like because our morning routine is so long, Alma, as you know, like
Yeah.
breakfast is an hour and a half, and then bathroom and dressing and everything is so long. I wouldn't register my kids to any activities that started before 11 o'clock because it was
Mhm.
just impossible. I couldn't
Right.
make it. That would be stressful for me. But nevertheless, the essence is not that the kids stay at home and are socially isolated. It's the opposite. You just kind of
Pick and
handpick
choose.
exactly
Mhm.
what you get involved with for them and what they like to.
Yeah. So there's a lot more freedom in that, which is really nice. So bringing up socializing. So uh, that's another issue that comes up, as the kids get older, when everybody's in preschool, and everybody's sort of in the same boat, and the kids are very young and not fully aware of, the differences. As the kids get older in school, it is, it's tough. It can be tough. There are exclusionary behaviors. Teachers. There's an unconscious bias, as we all know, for teachers and for children, and just for other adults, other staff in the schools. So there can be a lot of challenges. So constant communication in school is really necessary to keep your finger on the pulse of what's going on in the classroom and in the school, and especially in transition time from when there's not as much supervision by the teacher, because that's really when a lot of our problems started happening, when the kids had to line up, when the kids had lunch. There were all sorts of issues that arose. So communication is really important in school. For us, we started having some challenges very early on, starting in, I would say, first grade, where my son started feeling different from the other kids because he was pulled out for services and he wanted to be with his class. So there were all sorts of issues with that, and really having to talk to the teachers about pushing in, which is the term for when the therapists come into the classroom, as opposed to taking the children out, which is called pulling out, pull out sessions. My son, very early on, because he's very, very social and wants to be in the mix at all times, was very put off by being removed from the classroom instead of having a discrete session while the class was going on. So I did speak up quite a bit, and I was not listened to by the staff, unfortunately, for a very, very long time. But as soon as the changes were made, um, everything changed. And my son had been having meltdowns constantly. Every time he was pulled out, and they would say, well, his reading level is not going up. We don't know why. I'm like, well, maybe because he's tantruming every 2 seconds when you pull him out. How could he possibly learn anything if he's tantruming
Yeah.
and crying and screaming? So it's so important, even from a very young age. We're talking first grade. This was happening, to get those advocacy skills honed and bring someone. If you don't feel comfortable, a lot of us don't feel comfortable. It's a confrontation, and this is one of the downsides or upsides if you look at it in a different way, because you learn how to be more proactive and more, more of an advocate for your child by explaining to the staff and these teams for the individualized education plan. We as parents are in the schools are a member of the team. We are just as important as the speech therapist, as the paraprofessional, the aide in the class, as the OT, the occupational therapist, the teacher. We are a team member, and we need to always remember that we have a say in what goes on. So I did get a lot of pushback in those kind of situations, but they resulted in changes eventually, and things did improve. So it's all to say, some school settings can be phenomenal, but we do have to, and where we don't have to do anything, and you have a really professional staff in school that is on top of it, cares about your child, understands the disability. But unfortunately, more often than not, we have to really educate the team about what our kids' needs are, what is not working, and if we are not being heard, it is perfectly acceptable and appropriate to bring in an expert who, sometimes it's better to, it's helpful to have an objective person come in, observe the situation, and make recommendations rather than the parent. So that's one way to improve things in the school setting. But it's really, and I hate to say this, especially for people with young kids who are just starting this process, but it's really important that you stay on top of what is happening at school. And it's exhausting, and it can be really emotionally taxing to have to ask for things, not get those things, and to push to get them, because it might not be in our nature to push. For me, it is it is indeed in my nature, but it still felt uncomfortable, because having to advocate for these things is painful. Because, at least for me, I hoped that, boy, if people go into this profession, they're on top of it, they want the best for my child. And then when you find that they're giving you pushback, and you have to fight for your child when you thought you had an audience that was part of your team and wanting the best, and giving you all this pushback, that hurts, because it's yet another example of, oh my God, nothing's easy. Like, even, et tu brute, it's like, even people who you assume are going to be in your corner are not, for a variety of reasons. And unfortunately, a lot of the reasons have to do with money for the, in schools. It's hard to have to keep fighting, and nobody wants to be fighting all the time. It takes a lot of energy, and it is emotionally taxing, when it's your child and you have to be the lioness for them.
Yeah.
And I take it you
Always.
don't have to deal with stuff in the same vein. I'm sure you have other examples of that with homeschooling.
Yeah, I think that a lot of that, or a lot of those battles, are just not in the equation. And there are so many ways in which homeschooling, unschooling really does liberate you from dealing with yet another institution and another arena in which you have to fight for, I guess, equipment, services, time with therapists, etc. We had such a battlefield, with the insurance companies, and later on with the state with regards to like services at home, etc., that I always, when I heard from my friends and colleagues about like IEP meetings and, all of those arguments that really shouldn't be there, it's all that is happening is that people are fighting over resources that are too slim to fit everybody and all their needs. But every time that I would hear about those, I'm just like, oh my gosh, at least this, I don't have to deal with that. And that's one way in which the stress level in my life is decreased due to homeschooling. But
Mm-hmm.
at the end of the day, I think I'm remembering now the picture, that you sent to me of the lines and lines of gifts to all of the, professionals in your son's school. And that every year, at the end of the year, there's so many people to be grateful for in many different levels. And it's just it's also kind of the maybe a take of that school experience, that there are so many people involved and so many people that nevertheless at the end of the school year you are grateful to.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. There's some great staff and some not so great staff. And, like any other situation, it's, you just you have to work on it to make it as good as it can be. There's a lot of potential, but it requires our intense involvement. And that's not so easy for people who work outside the home, people who work in the home and have a challenging situation. It takes a lot of time and a lot of it can be very stressful, but it can pay off in the end. I like to be positive about it and think that the staff really do want to do the best for your child. Their intentions are good, but we are the experts on our kids, and we really have to educate them every step of the way about what our child's needs are, what works at home. And we would hope that in the school setting that they can be the professionals and they can carry out and they'll implement the suggestions that we make, and they won't get defensive or um, categorically say, no, this is not going to work for your child, and respect our input so that we can provide the best experience for our kids as possible. That's the goal. I will continue on to say that once my son, we had a lot of, challenges socially in leading up to middle school. But once middle school hit, the shit really hit the fan. And I'm going to say shit. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It was a freaking nightmare. And we never intended on, part of my intention, my philosophy, just as yours was with the homeschooling or unschooling philosophy. My philosophy was expose my son to as many neurotypical kids as possible, so he could model their behavior, so that the other kids can see um, children with disabilities, so that when they grow up they can hopefully employ people with disabilities, remembering my son, or they could befriend people who have disabilities. um, but I always said that I would not be a martyr for inclusion, because we spent 9 years in the public school system, and a lot of times I did feel like a martyr for inclusion. It was really tough. But once my son's physical and emotional safety really started to deteriorate, I felt that we did have to protect him. And as the kids got older, because of his behaviors and the other kids' behaviors, my son can be very provocative. That's some of the features of Prader-Willi syndrome that are very common, very provocative behavior to get people to pay attention. Like a lot of neurotypical kids will try to get negative attention because it's some kind of attention. So when he felt excluded, or he wanted to get a rise out of someone so that they'd pay attention to him, he would engage in provocative behaviors. Um, they weren't dealt with appropriately on many occasions by staff, and it resulted in other kids really um, taking steps, going home, talking to their parents about it. And parents, we will talk about this more in a future episode, but the police were called on Lincoln, because a parent felt that the staff didn't deal with the situations properly. Police were called, child welfare was called because the police were called. And at that point, as you might imagine, I felt that my son was not safe in the public school system. We were explicitly told that they could not keep our son safe once he went to high school, that they would not have the staff to deal with these types of situations. So we did choose to send him out of district, which I think the district was thrilled to to get us out of district. But that unfortunately became our journey, where it ended up in an out of district placement that, I have very mixed feelings about, because my son has very mixed feelings about. And as Iris, you've mentioned, in previous episodes, we really want to focus on how our children fare and what they want, how they feel, where they get their joy. And it was really hard for me because my son did not want to go out of district. He wanted to desperately to stay in district. And that was when I had to step in and I had to make the choice for him with my husband, because he was not safe anymore. And we couldn't keep other kids from doing certain things. We were not in school, so we couldn't keep our son from saying certain things. So it was, once you get to a point where you have to step in and make that decision, and it's not ideal. Our school, where he is it's not a perfect fit. And my son is desperate to go back to, a mainstream class in a school in our district, but we can't. We could, but the scale showed us that sometimes you have to make a very hard decision for to keep. The number one thing we have to do for our kids is keep them safe, and it was no longer safe for us. And that decision should never have to have been made by us. This is, we're going to bring it back to society now, that and the culture, school culture, just societal culture, where the way people are not educating kids about other children, with disabilities, and how these things need to be dealt with in schools. And this is, it is painful that our son he's not able to be in a public school, not because of his behaviors, but because of what's available in his school setting. So
Yeah.
that needs to change.
Yeah, that needs to change. And I think that the attitudes of parents of typical neurotypical children also need to change,
Mm-hmm.
because some kids do walk around with a sign that like maybe gives them a bit of a leeway in
Mm-hmm.
terms of their behavior. And when other parents of typical children can't forgive and forget about mishaps that happen because of lack of really ability, there is nothing there, that's a part of his disability, that's when society kind of shuts the door in our face as parents and as a community, the community of people with disabilities. And this is where this hits so close to home without ever sending my daughter to a school. It's just like society is still in so many ways not ready for our children, and there's the flag is kind of waving. Yes, we will do whatever the individual with the disability chooses and will accommodate and include. But the reality is, as you experienced firsthand, it is not so. Is not so when it stops being easy and stops being
Exactly.
self-explanatory on how do we, like, do this for this individual. Then people are kind of like, oh, this is new, it cannot be done, it was never done before. And this is where we have to kind of sometimes step in and recreate. And sometimes you just like, you're pushed to the wall and you don't have the possibility, when someone calls the police and the child welfare upon you, then you're kind of like, okay, my hands are up now.
Yeah.
This is beyond what I can deal with as a normative, law-abiding parent. And it's just so sad for me every time we talk about this story. I'm just so disappointed by society, by the community, because you live in a very good place, Alma, and you place that like really like shines themselves in like in being so inclusive, and yet the reality is not so
Yeah. Well, and
painful.
I think it's important. Thank you for saying that. I think it's also important, and I always want to reiterate this, that, um, if our kids who do have, you know, behavioral issues, because I think you're right. I think that it's all, unicorns and rainbows and flowers until there's a behavioral issue. And then inclusion becomes, you know, Oh, too hard. So inclusion means dealing with children with behavioral issues as well as kids who might have a learning disability or, you know, something that's not as uh, challenging to deal with in the classroom. But I want to say that it's also important for the safety of children who are being affected by children who have the behavioral issues. I always want to say that just because I don't think that a child with a behavioral issue that is hurting someone with words or physically should be allowed to run rampant and continue harming children who are neurotypical in the school, or children, other children who have disabilities. But it is the responsibility of the school staff to figure out a way to have the kids not only coexist safely, but to be able to interact in a way that is going to be beneficial for everyone. And so the fact that our situation led to a parent calling the police because the situation wasn't being handled well in school, that speaks volumes and about the school's role, like the importance of figuring out ways. And I'm not a school professional in that area, so I'm not even going to attempt to. I can certainly give suggestions, but I'm not. It's not my role. It shouldn't be our role as parents to have to instruct a school that accepts children who are different, who claims, as you mentioned, to be inclusive, but not take care of the children and keep them all safe when they're children with behaviors that could potentially be harmful, again, emotionally or physically. That is not. This is during school hours. This is not at home. This is at school, and it's, if you say you're going to do it and take care of our kids and educate them, then you better do it and keep everybody safe.
Yeah.
So the responsibility really lies in the staff of school, but that doesn't mean that we can't give our input. And I think it's vital that we give our input as parents to, because we have the most experience. You may have 30 years experience dealing with kids with disabilities as a professional, but you've never lived with our child. So everybody needs to listen to everyone else and keep everybody safe. So that's really important. I just want to
Yeah, and
definitely make that
also
point.
just with regards to what you mentioned earlier, it just, even in rehabilitation counseling, the statistic is where these are professionals that were kind of like, are meant to deal with people with disabilities, but still a research on the amount of time that rehabilitation counselor they spend the vast majority of their time with the people with the least severe disabilities, and the least amount of time with the people with the most severe disabilities. We are just biased kind of to go the easier route and to focus our attention on problems that are easier maybe to
Yes.
resolve in a way.
Mhm.
And this is where I think the system kind of in many ways neglects the kids and the adults later on with disabilities that needs the most attention, because if the bias is there, that's where really inclusion counts. What have we done with the most severe case? And if
Mhm.
the option wasn't there, like throw a child out of the school district, let
Mhm.
someone else handle it, what would they have done?
Yep.
And that's my question. And I'm sure between you and I, we can run at least 100 different solutions to the problem. the
Mhm.
the problem is when it's not solutions that they're asking for, they just want to eliminate the problem in a way.
Yes.
And it's
Yes.
it's very sad, but many parents are dealing with a facade of that kind of, in one way or another, where they feel that their kids with disabilities are being discriminated by the professionals that were placed
Mhm.
there to help them out. And
Yes.
that's sad and frustrating.
Yeah. Yeah. It's very, very challenging to navigate any kind of a system for our kids, but school, I think, is extra tough because we're trying to socialize our kids as well as educate them. So we have the educational piece that we're constantly having to modify to make our kids as successful as possible, and for us to be on top of that, but also the social interactions. And it's funny, you're reminding me that this conversation is reminding me that from day one with all of our IEP meetings, we would always say, or I would say, I couldn't care less about his academics. I just want to make, I don't care at all. I want him to be able to get along with other kids, conflict, as little conflict as possible, and for him to be able to make friends. And that was number one for me, because as we keep repeating in this podcast, if there's stress, our kids aren't going to be able to learn. And if they feel excluded or sad or angry or frustrated, they are not going to be able to take in any information to be able to learn. So to have the relaxed atmosphere where they feel safe and taken care of, that's the most important piece. And unfortunately, that's the piece that is, in my experience at least, and a lot of other parents I've spoken with, that's the piece that is dealt with the least in school, really fostering these relationships with kids. And a lot of it unfortunately has to do with the fact that staff are overworked, underpaid, have way too many kids to deal with, and they don't have the time to focus on that. But it's really the most, if we are going to be an inclusive society, the time and effort and money needs to go into making sure that all children feel accepted and safe, and that will allow them to be ready to learn, open to learn.
Yeah, I just, as we are kind of summarizing this whole school experience, I think that as a society, we also need to reevaluate maybe our values, because right now there is something kind of, I think, skewed up in terms of the education system in the US. It's like all achievement oriented, and everybody's kind of, on that line from high school to college, and there isn't really an emphasis on the in between. Maybe creativity, other occupations that don't require academic skills at such and such level, but are extremely essential for our existence as a nation. And I think that at the end of the day, if you can imagine a new method of rating schools by an annual survey, not a test, people, an annual survey of the kids' well-being and level of happiness, emotional and physical well-being, what a change would that bring? If the emphasis was how well our children are doing, then I'm sure inclusiveness in education would get a much higher level of priority, because kids, by virtue of being with a child that has some sort of a physical, emotional, or cognitive disability, they appreciate what they have. And they learn not only how to become more flexible thinkers and more adapted, I guess, team players in a way, they also have a new appreciation of what they have in their life just by being friends and being in the same classroom with a child who has a different ability. And I think we're missing out on so much in our society just by really focusing so much on academic success. There is a very little correlation between academic success and happiness and life success sometimes. And we have to maybe in a way advocate for our kids with disabilities, but by that we're also advocating for a better society.
That's right. And having kids not only appreciate what they have if they do not have that disability, but learning the special attributes that a child with a disability has that they might never have known had they not been sitting side by side with them in a classroom or in some kind of a it doesn't have to be a structured setting, but any kind of setting. But a lot of kids with autism and other disabilities are brilliant, absolutely brilliant, and have skills that neurotypical children do not have. Even if someone is a high support need, a child with high support needs, they might be incredibly adept at being creative in different ways with drawing or just anything, singing, having conversations about things that are interesting. There are so many it's not just a person with a disability. They are people. They have all sorts of, all different aspects of them, just like we all do. And it's important for people growing up, young minds, to be able to see that, oh, like I have a lot in common with that kid. I never would have thought that I did. These aren't even conscious thoughts. But for example, my son loves The Voice. He loves cooking shows. He can connect with other kids on those things, even though he might not be able to do the math that they do, or write an essay in the same way that they can. It's so important for kids to see the value in all aspects of our kids, and they're not going to see that unless they're in community with them. So it behooves, as you mentioned, it behooves schools to focus on this, because it will make for a happier, more inclusive society. And we all need to be working toward that. And it's a lot of work. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. It's a lot of work to be involved in all these things, but we do all sorts of other things for our kids. Let's do this one as well.
Okay, thank you so much for sharing. I think that's that was deep. What can I say? But yeah, that was our bit on education, and I think that obviously there's a lot to talk about education, and it would come up in other episodes. But we're really, really happy if people do comment and share their experiences and what they find as the best route for their kids, and what were the things that happened with their child's education that we can all learn and grow from that. Alma, do you have anything you want to summarize with for today?
Just keep an open mind, and if you see a child who is no longer in your school that might have had a disability, reach out to them and try to create community with them outside of school. And I have many other things to say, but we'll save them for future episodes. A lot to talk about with education, and we will have more episodes having speakers come talk about IEPs and the best way to write IEPs and all sorts of other things related to honing skills to make your child as successful as possible in the education arena.
Thank you so much, Alma. See you next time. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
For more information, please go to www.twomomsnofluff.com. Thank you.
If you like this podcast, please subscribe and give it a 5-star rating so more people can hear it. Thank you.